Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Hear the word of the Lord. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on godly things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who want to lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy messengers." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. The character of Satan figures much more prominently in our popular social conscience than it ever does in the Bible. Sure, we find terms like devil and Satan, Beelzebub in biblical passages, but they don't often reflect back our expectations. Job's Satan is not at all the figure we know from our cartoon depictions. The Hebrew there uses the definite article, which it never uses with proper names. Job's context does not refer to an entity in opposition to Yahweh's authority. It is rather a member of the heavenly court coming to present a regular report before the throne. In Mark's text, the Satan in question is no celestial being at all. It is Simon Peter, one of Jesus' own disciples. How then are we to understand and weigh our lives in opposition to God's purposes? We know better than to blame the devil for our own misdeeds. We know better than to cast responsibility for our failures and actions on some third party. Too much of our discourse and popular imagination, however, try to do just that. We conjure up some evil third party as though they were the origin of our failures. Cartoon depictions of Tom and Jerry's angels and devils floating just above their shoulders, whispering in their ear, form the language of our social theological discourse. It is ingrained in the popular theological imagination within which we live and move. We'd like to pretend that our depictions of Satan come from the gospel. We think they come from the Bible, but actually they come more from Greco-Roman mythologies filtered down through the works of Virgil and Dante, John Milton, and artists throughout the centuries, right down through Disney's Fantasia. The Bible never addresses the origin of this character we call Satan. He simply appears on the scene in New Testament texts with little, if any, explanation regarding who he is, what he does, and where he comes from. Without recognizing it, we have stolen concepts from the Greeks and Romans to fill in the gaps. Then we use those ideas to interpret the Bible, even if those foreign constructs don't fit the Scriptures. The Hebrew term Satan is simply the generic term for an adversary. It shows up in descriptions of an enemy army as a human adversary or fulfilling a political role akin to that of the prosecuting attorney. When we turn to the New Testament, we find Satan translated into the Greek as diabolos, the origin for our term devil. In today's passage, we find the Hebrew term transliterated into Greek, functioning potentially more like a name. Yet in this passage, Jesus' usage is nothing like what we would normally expect. Jesus indeed uses this Hebrew term transliterated, but Mark is careful not to include an article with it. Although Greek always uses definite articles with proper nouns. In Greek, it is the Jesus, the John, the Peter, the Paul. And yet here we find Jesus addressing Peter not with a definite article as though he were using a name, but referring to Peter as Satan in terms of being a descriptor of Peter's words, attitudes, and actions on display. Get behind me, you Satan, you enemy, you adversary. Jesus is not calling us to see the activity of some supernatural or celestial being involved in Peter's life at this moment in time. Rather, he is helping Peter and the rest of the disciples to see that Peter's words are those of one who is in opposition to God's purposes. Peter is not acting as the emissary of a devil. He has not been caught up as the marionette of some celestial, supernatural being who can pull on his strings and make him act as a puppet. Rather, Jesus' words are much more pointed than that, and not at all reflecting the activity of some supernatural being. Rather, Jesus' criticism of Peter is that his actions are all too human in origin. He says, "Get behind me, you Satan, you adversary, you accuser, you enemy. Because your words and your attitudes and actions on display are simply not in keeping with the ways and the thoughts of God. You are speaking and thinking all too humanly." That's the problem, isn't it? We want to attribute our baser motivations to some third party on whom we can pin the blame, and yet the problem is not a third party. The problem is us. We are the ones who have failed. We are the ones who have turned against God's direction, God's will, God's purposes. We are the ones who struggle against the things of God. Peter has gone so far as to pull Jesus aside to explain it to him. No, Jesus, this is not the way. This is not how to get things done. This is not what we want God to do. Let me tell you how you should be acting, how you should be thinking. Let me tell you what God must do from our human perspective. This is so much like the way we treat Jesus' teachings in so many aspects of our lives. Sure, Jesus, you tell us to love our neighbor, but they're just not worthy of our love and care and attention. They don't act like us. They don't think like us. They don't behave like us. They don't believe like us. How can I love them as myself when they won't even live according to my parameters, my rules? How do you expect me to turn the other cheek to one who wishes to harm me when I feel threatened? How do you expect me to forgive without boundary when I fully expect that this one you call me to forgive will turn around and harm me again? How can you expect me to offer grace without measure, compassion and mercy without limit, when I know that these people don't deserve you? We want to take Jesus' words and reinterpret them. We want to take the attitudes and character of God and transform them to make them more palatable to the way we see that life should be. That is the problem here with Peter. He's just too much like us. We want to be in the driver's seat. We want to tell God what to do and how and on whom God can show mercy and grace. We don't like this notion that if we are faithful to God, we might somehow suffer. We might grieve. We might face loss and uncertainty and doubt, difficulty, injury, and pain. And so we pull Jesus aside like Peter and say, well, Jesus, that's not really how life works. And Jesus turns to us as to Peter and says, "Get behind me, enemy of God. Follow me instead of trying to make me follow you. Get in your proper perspective and purpose and relationship with the one you would call Lord. And actually treat me as Lord. That is our difficulty with Jesus. He somehow simply does not bend to our will, to our ways of thinking. The problem is not some supernatural being who enters into the fray to twist our words and misdirect our purposes. It's rather that our purposes do not line up with God's. Our will and our attitudes do not line up with God's. And we, along with Peter, must be called back into an appropriate relationship where we enter this life of faith, willing to bow and serve, rather than be served and somehow dictate the terms to God. It is all too human a face we see on Peter. He is too much like ourselves. He and the other disciples were too caught up in humanly things, humanly understandings of how the world does and should work. And we're attempting to steer God away from this path of grace, mercy, and never-ending love. When will we learn to embrace the fact that the ways we oppose God are our own opposition to Christ? For it is only when we recognize that we are God's human adversaries that we can hope to be redeemed, reconciled, and transformed.